started shortly, so if you could please take a seat. Thank you everyone for joining our event today, Youth and Practitioners, Catalysts for Implementation of Science-Based Policy. My name is Michelle Mecklem and I'll be the moderator for today. I am the co-lead of the World Federation Engineering Organisation. By sharing their industry viewpoints and practical case studies, our young practitioners are positioned to influence the adoption of best practices. And finally, we're going to look at performance monitoring and verification. We will look into the intricacies of effective monitoring verification methods and their significance in ensuring the success of climate policy implementation. Decentralised cooperation among cities and peer-to-peer reviews will also be shown. Dr. Pickard.
Good morning to everyone. If I show you this picture of solar impulse above Abu Dhabi, it's not just to remind you that around the world on solar energy without fuel started in the Emirates and came back in the Emirates, but to explain you the paradigm that is existing today. When I launched this project, the specialist of aviation and the specialist of energy told me that it was impossible because the sun would never give enough energy to have an airplane flying day and night on solar. That's the certitude that the world still has. It's always a question of production. If we don't have enough energy, we have to produce more. How did we make it around the world? Not because we increased the power of the sun, but because and at the end, it was an odd for the youth. Is it really appealing for the politicians, for the economical world? I don't think so. What do we say? We say we have to decarbonize. We have to make a sacrifice in our economic development. We have to make a sacrifice in our life, in our mobility. So you maybe remember this beautiful quote from Einstein saying, madness means that you try all the time to do the same things and you worry because you don't have different results. And it's exactly what we're doing today. We have a narrative that doesn't work, and we continue with it, and we're surprised that it's always the same result and not a different one. So what we try to do with the Solar Impulse Foundation is to change this narrative. And based on the technical solutions that exist today, to be more efficient. This is the world that has to change. And if you come at the COP and you say you have to decarbonize, you'll have a lot of resistance from all the people who don't know how to decarbonize, from people who don't know that people who have not understood that the real problem comes from the inefficiency of our world. So if you come with a new narrative, as much for the politicians, for the negotiators, and this, I believe, is the narrative that was missing and is still missing. And that's why we try to work on it at every moment in the interviews, in the speeches, in the political meetings. Can you imagine how much it changes a COP if instead of speaking of the problems that are so difficult to solve, you come with 1,600 technical solutions, you put them on the table and you say, look, they're all profitable. Now you can use them and distribute them depending on which country it is, developing countries, developed country, young economies, old economies, this type of business, this type of industry, and you see which solution fits the best for which sector. And because they are profitable, you find the investments to implement them. Which means that for the youth, suddenly, it is not a future that is black and blocked. It is a situation where they can start to scream solutions instead of problem. Because if you start to scream solutions, then you are really pushing into action. If you're speaking about problems, you are just pushing paralyzes, fear, and inertia. So if you start to look what it really does, when you speak about these solutions, to have efficient buildings, efficient heating, cooling systems, electric mobility, new industrial processes, I believe that we cannot speak of closing old sectors without saying all the opportunities it makes for new sectors. It is not jobs that are going to be lost, it is new professions that are going to appear. And in these new professions, I tell you, there is not enough people. There's not enough people. If you have a magical decision to renovate all the building, to decarbonize and modernize transport and so on, who's going to do the job? If you want to install a heat pump with a geothermal well of 180 meters, like you can do in every city, there's nobody who has the training to do that. You need to wait months to have the work done. So these new jobs have to be pushed much more. And this myth of having only university graduate students having a good life was maybe right in the past, but it's not true now. Now the real future of the jobs is to have people knowing how to install a heat pump, a solar panel, how to insulate a building. And we must give them also a name that is appealing. They are not just plumbers or installers. They are technicians of the future. And I think this is the pride they should have when they say their job. We are technicians of the future. If we don't do that, we will not have the people that will go into these new sectors. And these new sectors, they are not here to save the planet. We have to stop this story of saving the planet. The planet will be better, much better off without us. We have to save humankind. And this is an argument that can be heard also by the climate change deniers. I hate this cleavage, this divide between the one who don't believe in climate change, the one who say climate change is obvious, because there's no collaboration between the two. Imagine there was no climate change. Imagine you get in the head of the people who are denying. There are still pollution, emissions, polluting emissions, killing 8 million people per year. That's not CO2, huh? That's poisonous emissions. You still have pollution in the oceans. You still have bad chemicals in the food. You still have biodiversity lost. All this does not depend just on climate change. So we need to take this language of better quality of life for humankind, not for the planet, but for us. And when we tell to people you have to make sacrifice for the next generations, in order for next generations to have a good life in 50 years, avoiding the ice to melt and the sea rise and something, do you think you will have a lot of people who will renounce to pollute today to avoid the ice melting in 30 years? Well, maybe the very respectful people, the ones who have compassion for the environment, compassion for humans. But that's not the majority of the people. Majority of the people are thinking short term. So we need to show the examples of how it's an advantage for today, to have better quality of life, to have the new jobs, to have less pollution, and also to make more profit. Because when we speak of the climate urgency, yes, okay, climate urgency, but it doesn't touch a lot of citizens, it doesn't touch a lot of businessmen, it doesn't touch the climate change deniers. So maybe we should also explain that by wasting natural resources, wasting energy, we waste money. It costs a fortune. It also costs a fortune to pay for the health. Climate urgency, it's also an economic imperative. Environment, making a real change in the way that is really putting momentum again. That's what I wanted to explain, and I hope this type of message can contribute to a better outcome of climate conferences. Good luck, good success. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Picard. I think you know, what you said about how our world is the world of the past really struck me, and particularly around how we need to change the narrative from the narrative that is currently quite depressing for everyone to a positive one to enable everyone to come on board and do the action that.
Oil was restrained or not. I flew around the world on solar power because I found it much better than to fly with oil, because you could recharge the batteries every day, spend the night in the air, have a new day in the air, and you could fly without limits. Because when we say the sky is the limit, it's wrong. The fuel is the limit. So I think it's exactly the same in our world. If you fight to have a phasing down or phasing out of fossil energies, you're going to fight for a long time. And maybe you can obtain a better result if you explain to the consumers.
Imagine places, reinvent places in a way that work for everyone, which are inclusive.
And not feeling depressed about the crisis. Nature's a huge part of that, right? There's tons of research out there that suggests that if human beings are in nature, they tend to feel better, they're more productive, more oxygen in their brains, they get more exercise. How do we bring nature and infrastructure together? That's what I'm going to be talking about later, but it struck me that that's a really nice way of bringing in that other issue that we're trying to deal with, which is the biodiversity crisis. And you know, infrastructure gets a bad rep for its impacts on nature, but done in a different way, infrastructure can have positive
of whether that's not have felt super insecure in those and mitigation in particular without monitoring is pretty much in companies committing to targets without actually knowing what their current emissions are. I've seen cities report emissions, where we're going and where we're still going, and whether we are still going in the right direction. As a member of the City Council of Cologne, I was asked to present a best practice today, and everything else. You have industry with a wide range of factories differing in every city. You have buildings in which people live and work, their heating, their cooling. You have agriculture, and many, many other things. Those likely to be the predominant categories. And receiving data from all those sectors requires intense collaboration to get all those people together and to put that together in one emission inventory that you can then steer as an organization has around how that is done, and put that emphasis on collaboration and motivation of people to actually help find a way to derive such a emissions inventory. Let's not repeat the mistake to create silos in our organizations, and especially as a young generation, we want and we need to collaborate more. If you talk to people, to pupils and students in schools, what they love most is their group work, if they have a motivated group. Let's put
providing the perspective from as a young elected official, and the significance of effective monitoring and verification of policies, as well as the importance of collaboration and motivation of communities. Next, I'd like to go to Robert to present the FIDIC and WWF Nature Positive Infrastructure Playbook case study.
Thanks. Is it possible to move on the slides for me? Great. Can I get the clicker? Fantastic, thanks. Yeah, so I'm really picking up on a couple of themes that we've already heard about this morning, which is collaboration and skills and different ways of thinking about the problems that we're trying to solve for organization. And you think, well, we're going to be working together? I think that's how far we've come along in the last few years, that now the environmental and the conservation organizations are recognizing that the best way to achieve their agenda of enhancing and rewilding Earth's natural systems, is to actually work with the engineering and infrastructure community hand in hand and look at joint solutions. So when I started talking to our colleagues at WWF through my role at FIDIC a year or so ago, I thought, well, how do we actually make that tangible? What can we do to make that road a bit easier to travel? And we came up with the idea of a playbook for nature positive infrastructure development. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today as a practical case study of how we can bring those communities together. Now, if you look at many of the large organizations that enable infrastructure, and AECOM, which my day job is working for AECOM, we're one of those organizations. We have a huge number of structural and civil engineers in the business. We also have a large number of environmental. We need to work together in a slightly new way and think about how their respective skills don't work alongside each other, the environmental teams mitigating the impacts of the infrastructure teams, but rather the two teams coming together speaking the same infrastructure that is going to be nature positive. So for me, that's a shift in mentality, and also it requires some new skills. Let's make this a really attractive proposition to actually bring our engineering skills together with our natural capital assessment and ecological ecosystem services restoration skills, and make a new way of working. And so I'm just going to very quickly skim through what you could get if you, and I've got a hard copy here, one of the rare hard copies that exists, because of course this is all digital. What you'll get if you go and have a look at the FIDIC WWF playbook, which was authored by AECOM. So I think I've pretty much covered the rationale. We want to make it easier for our two communities to work together as one and create infrastructure that has positive impacts for nature and for biodiversity. How do we set about doing that? Well, we thought that a sectoral approach would make sense. We then thought, in terms of the attractiveness, what are the benefits of doing this? And the wonderful thing about this approach is there are so many co-benefits. And Dr. Pickard also touched on that, Anusha, you touched on that, Kiroz, you touched on that as well. When you bring infrastructure and nature together, you get so many benefits for society and humankind that it's pretty clear. Then you've got the solutions that we need to get our heads around and need to become common practice, and then I'll talk about some additional resources and case studies. So it's always nice to have a wheel, isn't it, to illustrate how a structure could work. So very much we're looking at a sector-based approach in the playbook to make it just easier to navigate, right? So water and wastewater, energy, transportation, coastal and public spaces are the areas that we cover. And then within those sectors, we have different asset types. So a typology of nature solutions or nature approaches that would fit with that infrastructure asset type is the way we. When we're looking at the benefits, we've principally relied on three key benefits that we know are good for society and humankind. Biodiversity, in our infrastructure. When we're looking at the solutions, we're looking at tried and tested approaches that are out there within the practice of our communities in engineering, environmental services, but which perhaps aren't widespread. A famous science fiction writer wrote, the future is already here, but it's not universally spread around in the right way. It's not just, we need to scale this very quickly and implement more widely. And so the solutions gives a good understanding of the different kinds of nature solutions that fit with the infrastructure and how you implement that. So what are the key messages that you can take away from the playbook right now? And I want to emphasize that this is a live document. It's a first version. We definitely want to do more to make the playbook more useful and more accessible. And I was just talking to Anusha about possibly collaborating to look at more areas of expertise in terms of how do we help the investor community understand the nature positive infrastructure approaches? How do we standardize some of the terms? As for many of our professional lives, there's an alphabet soup of acronyms around nature-based solutions and TNFD and all these different things that we know we've got to become aware of. But how do we actually standardize that so that, in particular, our engineering community, who like to work to standards and know if I do this with this asset, I will get this result. That's what we need to make clear within terms of natural systems, right? So that's where it really comes down to a collaboration between the people who know how to do natural capital assessments and accounting, and translating that into building information modeling and other engineering design tools that allow a real integration of those approaches to work together seamlessly, often in a digital world where a lot of our design processes take automated too.
Which tries to represent the global community of young engineers, and the World Federation itself are very much solutions orientated. And we've been engaged in the COP process since COP26 and have existed as a group since pre-COP26. And through these years, we've been developing policy recommendations, both national, international, specifically for COP, and trying to kind of change the narrative and really provide the young engineers perspective. Also been trying to influence our companies within and really, act by example, drive change from within and influence the wider industry. From those engagements, in particular from the engagements of policymakers, we found that there are some inefficiencies and actually some frustrations on both sides, both on policymaker sides and on the youth side. And the spectrum of youth is actually quite broad as well. So you can think about people who are very passionate about climate action, want to make a difference, but may not necessarily have the right capacity or experience. And you're going to have quite experienced engineers, so say a decade in the industry, really thought-leading expertise, people with PhDs, people who can really drive the solutions forward. So, and being solutions-oriented, we decided to do something about those inefficiencies. So I would like to share the piece of work that we've been developing over the past couple of years, which is Youth Empowerment Framework. So I'll briefly share how we started this. So it was just before COP27, what outcomes we got, and we'll pass on to Angelos to talk about the framework itself and the call to action. So just before COP27, we conducted a survey both of policymakers and of youth to understand what the barriers are, what the opportunities are, and really where we can make the difference. And I found that, for example, from the youth side, and what Christian has also mentioned, there's been a significant frustration with the lack of transparency and lack of follow-through. So sometimes you develop those solutions, but there is a lack of two-way dialogue, and actually it's not clear how certain solutions are being industry and make sense from the scientific perspectives are not brought forward. And from the policymaker perspective, for example, one highlighted piece of feedback is legal enforcement of policy. And also, young policymakers recognized the benefits that youth and the society as a whole gets from effective youth engagement. Also, we conducted a literature review to understand what work has already been done to make this process more effective. We had a quite engaging event, a panel discussion between several senior policymakers, both from developed and developing countries, and young engineers and young to really drive the conversation forward. And then we ended the year with a paper published by the working group. So altogether, the three main challenges which we see is science policy divide, which we try to address, lack of implementation of existing policies. So, something can be done on paper, but actually doesn't get implemented. So, and this is what we're talking about today as well, with monitoring and verification to get this feedback process going and to really implement effective policies. And then thirdly, the ineffectiveness of the current processes of inclusion of youth in decision making. And the two things that has to come out of this is the framework, so which will increase accountability, performance monitoring and verification of climate policy, and also introduction of systematic processes and platforms for youth inclusion decision making. Talk about the framework in more details.
Cool, thank you. Good to see everyone. Very briefly, to echo what was said beforehand, it's very important to awareness and understanding of the problem, and then action and implementation of policy and technical solutions to these challenges. Through this framework, what we've tried to address as young engineers ourselves is the mobilization of already aware young people to assist the implementation of these practices for climate action through a framework that gives them the tools to participate in decision making within big organizations. So what we've tried to put together is an adaptable framework for those who are, for organizations, entities, companies, businesses, whoever it might be, to meaningfully engage and empower the young people across all of the stages within their organizations to implement some policy and make this. Provide the capacity building and the training and the knowledge and the skills to these young people on how to effectively engage within the existing structures that already sit within their organizations, to build on the awareness of the value that young people can bring on the table for decision making. As we all hopefully agree, young people have the power to innovate, they have the power to bring something new to the conversation, and they're not necessarily children as they are often perceived as. They are young professionals, they are young entrepreneurs, they are young people that can drive the change that we need to be. So just a small, because I know we've played with terminology quite a bit today, I'm not a big fan of the future leaders term for young people. I think they are the leaders of today. We just need to give them a bit more of a platform and make sure that they can actually bring about the change that we need, because we know we're falling a bit behind on our target. So closing parenthesis on semantics. And then lastly, even though we can make the young people able to bring about change, we can make the organizations aware of the value of that change, there are still systemic barriers that need to be removed. There's still improvements and efficiencies to be made into. The next step would be inclusion, bringing them within the conversation without necessarily having them sit in the room and listen in to understand why things are the way they are, why it takes time to actually make a significant decision, and how these decisions are made. Number three, which is a bit vague perhaps, but it's critical in our opinion, is teaching young people how to navigate the existing systems. Even though you might be aware and you might be in the room, it's a very different thing to be playing the game yourself, to be able to utilize the tools that are available to you to create change and bring change forward. So giving the skills to young people to navigate whatever space it might be, internal politics, external politics, politics in general. I didn't want to say political politics, but I'm talking about the societal side of things. It is important for young people to know where, actually taking that step from awareness and soft participation into action. Lastly, number 4, a new generation of leaders, creating those decisions makers at a younger age, whether internal or external, letting them take the first step and execute on decisions that they've taken themselves. So without further ado, without taking up any more time from you today or the rest of the panel, we need partners for this. This is an idea that's very early on. We do need to try it out and see how it will actually work in big organizations or small organizations or whatever system we want to apply this to, because at the end of the day, this is the point. We want to create a framework that's applicable anywhere, adaptable anywhere, and it can provide the means to empower young people. So if any of you, whether it's private sector, public sector, or the third sector, would like to help us try this out as an early adopter, please scan the QR code or come and talk to us after this. Thank you.
I want to first acknowledge what is happening currently. There are some nuggets of things that are happening, whether they're happening at a scale we want is different. For example, we have at Institute of Civil Engineers, we've got a program called Enabling Better Infrastructure. So in Egypt, for example, you've got the popular between the industry and government. Then we have the Climate Change Committee, which their annual reports, the National Infrastructure Commission and Climate Change Committee's reports sometimes are damning reports, and they put the government's feet to the fire. But now I come to the blockers. So sorry, one more thing that I would say is between the science and policy and implementation is also bridging the gap. And I know one of my colleagues, Bruce Lascelles, is just sitting here. He just walked in, and I thought of what he's trying to do is the trees which can withstand this temperature and have more greenery in places like this. So I think keeping it very simple and keeping it what is actually needed is very seen around. Like I think is it 1.2 billion population is youth. So that's a massive skill force. If we don't bring them to the table, we're missing out on all that intelligence. So how do we bring them to the table? And they are the innovators. They are the ones who are most at stake. They are the biggest stakeholder. If you do stakeholder mapping, they're the biggest stakeholders on every single project we have. So how do we bring them to the table, to the decision-making table? And equally, there are other sectors we don't talk to as much. You've got 80%, we talked about nature, absolutely. I think it should be, the business cases should be very much like, why can't you have nature positive infrastructure? Rather than it's business as usual and diversity is managed by indigenous people, and yet they're 5% of the population. And how much do we bring them on board? We always talk about hard science. We always talk about PhDs and scientists. Absolutely, we need that. But what about the traditional science? They've been managing nature. They've been managing water resource for centuries. How do we bring that back? In fact, my first job was way back in '97, was in sustainable building materials, and we were looking at compressed earth blocks and ferrocement roofing channels. And the world's come back to that. How do you use mud blocks because they're the best for insulation, whether it's hot or cold? So I think some of that, bringing the hard science, but bringing the traditional science together. So I think if there was one thing you talk about, collaboration, genuine connection, and then we are in the most amazing part of times where we have data digital. How can we use data digital to speed up what all I'm talking about? So use the data and digital technology to speed up things. How do we find something like apps where it's like in this part of the world, they've already used nature-based solutions and that's really worked well and we quickly get it. So I think using data and digital as enabling tool rather than the solution itself is hugely important. And I think it's also indigenous populations of bringing them at the table, learning from them. And for them, it's a very emotional topic. And I think sometimes we feel as engineers and scientists, it's soft skills to be emotional. It's soft skills to be talking about things. I think those are essential skills, something like kindness. I think it's the number one attribute, if I think, whether you're a scientist, an engineer, a filmmaker, an artist, we need to start bringing that as a special attribute. We should start testing people. Are they kind to people and planet? Is that at the heart of the engineering solution? Is that at the heart of the scientific solution? And I think those are the attributes we want to bring in. And then people, ultimately, this is one opportunity all of us have in redesigning and rebuilding a world that works for everyone. But for example, if we are trying to design something, are we looking at people with different abilities? Do they have a say? I remember I did a panel discussion, I think it was 5-6 months ago in London at Arcadis, and we had got someone from the Disability Forum. And after the forum, he just couldn't thank me. He said, we are never asked to be a part of the panels. Nobody asks us what we want. So this is so important that because if we are designing, are we designing for those people as well? And we know that if we design for majority benefits anyway. So why wouldn't we do that? So I think it's bringing all the people together, but not just bringing them, but listening genuinely to them. Getting that, the scientific research, backing of scientific research. So if I had to summarize all this, have the traditional science, have the hard science together, then when you get to the policy tables, think about, we don't have all the time in the world. Yes, we have a climate and nature emergency, that's the real fact, because we're already on a 2.5 trajectory, which means some of the small island states will be underwater. So that is an emergency. And yes, we have a huge opportunity to redesign places. So how do we get the right people on board? But also, I would say to the policy and governments that when COVID happened, I know in the UK, we passed the bill in 24 hours. So why can't we do things? We can do things in, I would say, 24 months. Even if you don't take 24 hours. But let's do things 24 months, but do it with an end date in place, but not have this continuous thing. So I think it's the pace, it's the time, it's making connections for the right and making it real. When you're doing a project, look around you, who's going to benefit? Who are the people? And do they have some knowledge which we don't have? Because some of the times we get the right consultants, we get the right people on table, and some of the times we don't get the citizens who we're designing for. I remember I was on one project and we had one guy who knew the area for like 50, 60 years. And all of us were thinking about, yes, this is what we need to do. And he said, by the way, did you know in 1955 there was a ditch here, there was a water ditch which was then blocked. None of us knew, none of the maps had that. So bringing in that knowledge, historical knowledge from local people. And sometimes we don't value that. We just think their time is for free. Can we also bring them as consultants and pay them for their time? So I think all I'm wanting to say is that there's a lot we can do, but if we can bring it to the reality on ground is hugely important. And then structure it, then have the frameworks. And our children and their children will be impacted. So I almost say that boundaries has blurred now. Because whatever sector we're in, whether we're a lawyer, whether we're an engineer, whatever decisions we're making is going to be for our very existence on this planet. And let's not forget that. But on a positive note, I would say, I think I read it on Facebook somewhere. Someone said, what can I do as one person? Said 7 billion people. I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Anusha. Yes, you're right, we do need to keep it real and simple, and I think a big theme of the case studies that we've been presented has been around collaboration and the inclusion of marginalised communities. And I want to move on to the Q&A, and we've been talking a lot about the inclusion of youth at the policy making table, and Christian, you represent the CEMR platform, a Young Elected Officials Committee. Would you be able to briefly tell us a bit about the mandate and the activities of this platform?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So imagine your local council at home in your, if you're lucky and live in a democracy, if you have an elected council and pick people you've seen on the posters of the last election. How many of those were below the age of 30, define young elected. That is a key problem, especially when it comes to climate change policy, because that is so much looking into the future, so much looking into future opportunities. And when I look across the different parties, not only in my council, but across other councils in Europe, across different parties, young people have similar attitudes toward climate change policy. And this is why I think it is so important that we as a Young Elected Officials Committee come together, because we have similar challenges, whether you're in Barcelona or whether you're in Oslo or whether you're in Katowice or in Cologne as I am. And that helps a lot to get an idea of what our common challenges are, how we best practices, how we overcame them, to get input from the EU institutions, although CEMR is not only EU, it's broader than that, luckily. And to simply help each other. So that's the mandate of the Young Elected Officials Committee, and I'm representing both the young people in that sense, if at 35 I still count as young, and the other part is then the local level and the young people in local level.
you know, in New Zealand, the young elected officials group, they had to raise the age to 40 because there weren't enough people in the young elected officials group. So
Sad fact.
Yes, it's very important that we have these organisations and platforms to help our young elected officials. I want to move to the engineers, and I guess I want to know about what role that the engineering industry has in terms of bridging the gaps in climate policy making, and specifically performance monitoring verification, and how the industry can better support this.
So on the verification side, is it?
Yes, verification, performance monitoring.
I think it's about testing at every, whether we have any policy document that's coming out, any thought paper that's coming out. It's almost like having how we had equality, diversity, inclusion. We have pretty much, it's not another separate project. It is underpinning everything that we do, and having a similar kind of, basis for verification as well. What we said at the start that we would do, what does it actually mean? So many projects we've done, and testing them against what was agreed. That, for example, did we have youth on every panel? Did we have youth at the policy tables when the decisions were making? When we were producing documents, how many of them were under 35? But equally, not just you, did we reach out to Indigenous people if it was relevant? Did we speak to people who are differently abled? And I think having some sorts of metrics to see how many projects did that would be a good way to start. Because if we all challenge ourselves, not have the same people churn out the reports over and over again with some different words. So I think that would be a good start. I think it's a personal challenge, a professional challenge to everyone to check and verify for any piece of research, any piece of policy, any project implementation document, anything that's one way to verify.
If I could add something to that as well. I think I was part of a really interesting group discussion a couple of evenings ago with the Race to Zero team, looking at serviced emissions. And that's quite a new concept for industry to get our heads around. Already you're seeing some progress from the advertising industry and the legal industry. But in the built environment, the question is, beyond our scope 1, 2 and 3, right? We know how to start managing that and bring that under control. But there's another element. At ACON, we call it scope X, but other people call it serviced emissions. It's really the emissions that are associated with the design process. You're designing infrastructure, there's embodied carbon there, there's operational carbon there. How do you account for that? And I think it's striking a new process of when you're taking on a project, so there's actually an ESG governance piece here. When you're looking at a project and you're doing your due diligence, do we bid for that project? Do we want to undertake that project? Do we want to be known for that project as a legacy? What are the emissions potentially associated with that? What's the clean energy opportunities there? What's the opportunities to bring in natural systems and nature positive approaches? So I think really at the moment it's just thinking about serviced emissions. But you could broaden that out to wider sustainability questions. And I think one of the things that we need to be doing in the engineering sector, and with our youth and our younger careers folk, can really make a big impact here, is asking the right questions about the work that we do and looking at what the impacts of that will be, and applying our skills to the projects and processes and programs that are going to have a positive impact for society and the planet.
Sorry, Kuros, did you want to add?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And first of all, I would agree with everything that's been said by Christian, Anusha, and Robert. One thing that I'd like to add is, I think, from the government perspective and the policymaker perspective, one of the key aspects is to create a level playing field, and also, at the same time, make sure that decisions are taken at the most effective level. So whether it is for engineers, whether it is for governments, whether it is for individuals. Because say if we take adaptation, explaining the benefits of adaptation to individual people and getting them to act can be quite difficult. So as engineers, we need to, and government, we need to be much better at communicating. But also we need to think, say, for private private renters, so people who rent houses rather than own houses, would they be in the most effective position to adapt themselves? Say, adapt their house to flooding, adapt their house to heat waves, or is there a wider, kind of more effective position at another level? And I think when I'm talking about new developments, so new housing, new transport infrastructure, we need to think, how can we, as engineers, communicate with the policymakers and infrastructure clients what is the most effective level of decision making and what processes and what policies need to be put in place to, on one hand, create the level playing field, and on the other hand, make sure that those long-term solutions which make financial sense in the long term and actually cheaper in the long term are actually available to engineers from the financial perspective, and we're not focused on those short-term solutions. And also one thing that I would like to pick up on is what Anusha said regarding those indigenous knowledge, and but also combining for this with the digital skills and building on kind of the smart technologies we have. And I think as engineers, we need to do both. So on one hand, we need to think what is the scope of what we're doing, because sometimes the most effective way to decarbonize and to remove carbon from existing developments is actually to de-scope. Like, do you actually need this? Can we implement measures to existing infrastructure in order to meet our goals rather than building something new? And then we start looking at the smarter technologies. So, and in the Middle East as well, it's a very good example how we use passive shading rather than active cooling. And I think
I think often in conferences like COP28, we come away with lots of work that needs to be done, and we're inspired by the high-level conversation. But I wonder if each of you have one key thing that the audience can take away, so when we go back to work in a week's time, back to our realities, something that we can do to enable, to implement of the things that we've talked about in terms of collaboration and performance monitoring.
I think for me it would be just following up actually on Dr. Picard's suggestion that when you're opening these topics of conversation around climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, you open it up with the opportunity to be seized, with the skills that are going to be needed, and with bringing the right people around the table to get a solution in place quickly. So that just feels really tangible to me.
And I would say, I think what Kirill's kind of said was, whether you're an engineer or you're a retailer or something, it's like, do you even need a new thing? It could be new clothes, it could be a new building, it could be anything. Can you repurpose what you've already got, number one? And if you do, can you do it in a way that you put nature and people at the heart of it? And there are enough tools out there that can help you. And you don't have to find the best tool, just pick any tool and just follow it. It'll still be better than where we are now. So it'll never get perfect, you'll never have the best tool in the world. Take you in a much better place than where we are. So that would be something tangible. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to encourage all of you to go to your local administration. How many young people do you have in the elected body? And secondly, ask for emissions and ask for a plan. I'm very happy that I have to fly home tonight, not because I'll be in a plane all night, but because tomorrow in our city council we will decide on our carbon reduction plan, and I want to be there for that meeting to make sure that we actually have an idea how it's going down. And it has changed tremendously in the past 3 years because people put more pressure on the local administration and people wanted that to change. So go home and ask, what are our emissions? What are you doing to reduce it on the very local level? Because that is the closest you can get to politicians and the easiest you can get to your local politicians. Thank you.
So I think for me, and also actually something that's been said by Dr. Pickard as well, is we need to implement more of the solutions that already exist, which we know work. And it's something that we don't do enough. And as engineers, I think we have to be at the forefront of advising and providing those case studies and saying, look, you know, some of the things we actually need to do all the innovation for, those solutions already exist, have been tried and tested, and we just have to act on them. And secondly, both a piece of advice to private organizations and public sector: empower your people, empower engineers, empower young engineers, empower young people, empower your constituents and stakeholders, and just see what value comes out of it. And I can guarantee that the value is quite significant. And I think this is something that we've seen both as an example of our group within institutions of engineers and at AICM as well. So, Michelle?
Yeah, thank you very much. So today we've talked about ethics behind underpinning the work that we do. We've talked about collaborating and empowering our marginalised communities. We've also talked about keeping it real and simple. Thank you, Anusha. And also about including and incorporating traditional and Indigenous knowledge and how we reframe our messages to people. I think these are very important discussions that we've had today, and I would love to thank the panellists for your remarks, and particularly for the call to action to everyone. And on behalf of the World Federation of Engineering Organisations, Young Engineers, a Future Leaders Working Group on Climate Action, the Council of European Municipalities and Region, Engineers Without Borders, FIDIC, we would like to thank everyone for coming to our event today. Thank you very much.